The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Adelaide Cottage, casting gentle shadows across the breakfast table where the Wales family gathered for what had become an increasingly rare moment of normalcy. Catherine stirred her tea slowly, her eyes fixed on her youngest son Louis, who sat unusually quiet beside his older siblings. The 7-year-old's typically animated chatter had been replaced by a subdued demeanor that had been growing more pronounced over the past several weeks. William noticed it too. As he helped Charlotte with her school bag, his gaze kept returning to Louis, who was mechanically eating his cereal without his usual enthusiasm for the day ahead. The boy's shoulders seemed to carry a weight far too heavy for someone so young, and it was breaking both parents' hearts to witness. "Louis, sweetheart," Catherine said gently, reaching across to smooth down a rebellious strand of his sandy hair. "How are you feeling about school today?" The little boy looked up at his mother with eyes that seemed older than his years. There was something there, a shadow of confusion and hurt that made Catherine's chest tighten with maternal concern. Louis had always been their spirited child, full of laughter and mischief, but lately he seemed to be retreating into himself. "I'm okay, Mummy," Louis replied quietly, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. He glanced briefly at his father, then back down at his bowl, as if afraid to meet their concerned gazes for too long. George, ever the protective older brother, seemed to sense the tension at the table. At 10 years old, he was becoming increasingly aware of the complexities that surrounded their family life. He reached over and gently nudged Louis's arm in a gesture of silent support, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he tried to lighten his younger brother's mood. Charlotte, 8 and perceptive beyond her years, watched the interaction with the careful attention she had inherited from both her parents. She had noticed the changes in Louis too, the way he had stopped asking to play their usual games, the way he seemed to shrink away from conversations about school and friends. After the older children left for school, William and Catherine found themselves alone with Louis for a few precious minutes before his own school day began. The silence that had settled over the cottage felt heavy with unspoken concerns and the weight of decisions that needed to be made. Catherine knelt down to Louis's eye level, her hands gently holding his small shoulders. Her heart ached as she saw the vulnerability in his young face, the way he seemed to be trying so hard to be brave despite whatever was troubling him. "Louis, my darling boy," she said softly, her voice filled with all the love and protection she felt for her youngest child. "You know that Daddy and I love you very much, don't you? And that you can tell us anything, absolutely anything that's on your mind?" Louis nodded slowly, his bottom lip trembling slightly. For a moment, it looked as though he might open up, might share whatever burden he had been carrying. But, instead, he simply wrapped his arms around his mother's neck in a fierce hug that spoke volumes about his need for comfort and security. William watched this tender moment between his wife and son, feeling his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. As a father, his instinct was to protect his children from anything that might cause them pain or distress. But he was also acutely aware that their position in the public eye meant that Louis faced challenges and pressures that other children his age never had to navigate. The drive to school was quieter than usual. Louis sat in the back seat, his small hands folded in his lap, occasionally looking out the window at the familiar countryside passing by. William caught his son's eye in the rearview mirror and offered an encouraging smile, but he could see that Louis was lost in his own thoughts. When they arrived at the school gates, Catherine walked Louis to his classroom, as she had done countless times before. But today felt different. Today, she paid closer attention to the other children and parents, wondering if something in this environment was contributing to her son's distress. Mrs. Henderson, Louis's teacher, greeted them warmly as always, but Catherine noticed a slight hesitation in the woman's manner, a momentary glance that suggested she, too, had observed changes in Louis's behavior. "Mrs. Henderson," Catherine said quietly, after Louis had gone to hang up his coat with the other children. "I wonder if I might have a brief word with you later today?" "About Louis?" The teacher nodded understanding immediately. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. I've actually been hoping to speak with you and the Prince of Wales. Perhaps we could arrange a time this afternoon?" Catherine felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at the teacher's quick agreement. On one hand, it confirmed that they weren't imagining Louis's struggles. On the other hand, it suggested that whatever was happening was significant enough to require adult intervention. As Catherine walked back to the car where William was waiting, her mind was already racing through possibilities. Was Louis being bullied? Was he struggling academically? Was the pressure of his royal status beginning to weigh on him in ways they hadn't anticipated? William took one look at his wife's face and immediately understood that their concerns were justified. They drove home in contemplative silence, both lost in thoughts about their youngest child and how they could best help him navigate whatever challenges he was facing. The cottage felt strangely empty without the children's presence, and Catherine found herself wandering into Louis's room, sitting on his bed surrounded by his toys and books. Everything looked normal, peaceful even, but she knew that appearances could be deceiving, especially when it came to a child's inner world. William found her there, sitting quietly among their son's belongings, her face etched with the particular kind of worry that only parents know. He sat beside her on the small bed, his large frame looking almost comical in the child-sized space, but his presence immediately comforting. "We'll figure this out," he said quietly, taking her hand in his. "Whatever it is, we'll help him through it." Catherine nodded, drawing strength from her husband's certainty. They had faced challenges before as a family, had weathered storms both public and private. But this felt different because it involved one of their children, their baby, who deserved nothing but happiness and security in his young life. The phone rang in the distance, interrupting their quiet moment of reflection. It was their private secretary, reminding them of the afternoon's scheduled engagements. But both William and Catherine knew that today, their son's needs would take precedence over any official duties. "I'll call and reschedule," William said, already reaching for his phone. "Louis is more important than any meeting." As the afternoon approached, they prepared to return to the school for their conversation with Mrs. Henderson. Both parents felt a mixture of anxiety and determination, ready to face whatever revelations awaited them about their son's struggles. The drive back to the school was filled with quiet conversation as they discussed potential scenarios and how they might address them. Catherine's maternal instincts were in full force, her mind cataloging every interaction she had witnessed, every change in Louis's behavior over the past weeks. Walking through the school corridors toward Mrs. Henderson's classroom, they passed displays of children's artwork and achievement certificates. Catherine found herself searching for Louis's work among the displays, hoping to gain some insight into his state of mind through his creative expressions. Mrs. Henderson welcomed them into her classroom with a gentle smile, but her expression quickly turned serious as she gestured for them to take seats in the child-sized chairs arranged around a small table. The incongruity of the situation, two of the most recognizable people in the world squeezed into furniture designed for 7-year-olds, would have been amusing under different circumstances. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us," William began, his voice carrying the weight of his parental concern. "We've noticed some changes in Louis lately, and we're hoping you might be able to shed some light on what might be troubling him." Mrs. Henderson nodded thoughtfully, her hands clasped together on the table. As an experienced teacher, she had dealt with many different challenges over the years, but the situation with Louis was unique in its complexity. "I'm glad you reached out," she replied. "Louis is such a bright, wonderful little boy, and it's clear that something has been weighing on his mind recently. I've been observing him carefully, and I think we need to discuss some of the challenges he's been facing, particularly in relation to his interactions with some of his classmates." Catherine felt her heart sink at the teacher's words, while William's expression grew more serious. They both braced themselves for whatever revelations were about to come, knowing that understanding the problem was the first step toward helping their beloved son. Mrs. Henderson's classroom felt smaller as the conversation deepened, the weight of revelation hanging heavy in the air between the three adults. The teacher's gentle manner couldn't soften the impact of what she was about to share about Louis's recent experiences at school. "I've been teaching for over 15 years, Mrs. Henderson began carefully, and I've seen how children can sometimes struggle with differences, whether real or perceived. Louis is dealing with something that's quite unique for a child his age." Catherine leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Every maternal instinct was on high alert as she waited for the teacher to continue. William remained still beside her, but she could feel the tension radiating from him as they prepared to learn what had been troubling their youngest son. "There have been several incidents over the past few weeks," Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice measured and professional despite the sensitivity of the subject. Some of the other children have been asking Lewis questions about his family, about what it's like to live in a palace, whether he has servants, that sort of thing. Initially, these seemed like innocent curiosity from his classmates. William nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn on his face. They had always known that their children would face unique challenges because of their position, but they had hoped that Lewis, being the youngest, might have more time before these realities truly impacted his daily life. But the questions became more persistent, the teacher went on. And some of the children began treating Lewis differently. Not necessarily in a mean way, but with a kind of awe that was isolating him from normal childhood interactions. Some would bow to him during playtime, others would refuse to play certain games with him because they said he was too important to get dirty or make mistakes. Catherine felt her heart break a little more with each word. The image of her spirited little boy being treated as something other than just a child was almost unbearable. She could picture him standing alone on the playground, confused by the sudden change in how his friends were treating him. And then, Mrs. Henderson hesitated, clearly struggling with how to phrase the next part of her revelation. There was an incident last week that I think really affected him. During lunch, one of the older children from another class came over and started asking Lewis if he could get his father to knight their father, or if he could invite their whole family to live in a castle. William's jaw tightened perceptibly. The innocence of childhood questions was one thing, but the idea that adults might be using their children to try to gain access or favors through Lewis was something else entirely. When Lewis tried to explain that it doesn't work that way, that his father couldn't just do things like that, the older boy accused him of lying and being selfish. He said that if Lewis really cared about his friends, he would use his family's power to help them. Several other children gathered around to listen, and Lewis became quite upset. Catherine closed her eyes briefly, imagining the scene. Her 7-year-old son, surrounded by children who suddenly saw him not as a playmate but as a potential source of magical solutions to their family's wishes. The weight of expectation and misunderstanding must have felt enormous to someone so young. What happened next? William asked quietly, though his voice carried an edge that suggested he was working hard to control his emotions. Lewis ran to the bathroom and stayed there until I found him. He was crying, not just because his feelings were hurt, but because he felt confused and guilty. He kept asking me if he was supposed to be able to help everyone, if there was something wrong with him because he couldn't give his friends what they wanted. The teacher paused, giving the parents a moment to absorb the full impact of what their son had experienced. The silence in the classroom was profound, broken only by the distant sounds of children playing outside during their afternoon break. Catherine wiped away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts to remain composed. He's been carrying this guilt around for a week? Feeling like he's disappointing people because he can't wave a magic wand and fix everything? Mrs. Henderson nodded sympathetically. I tried to talk to him about it, to explain that he's just a little boy and that none of those expectations are fair or realistic. But I think the damage was already done. Since then, he's been much quieter, more withdrawn. He seems to be constantly analyzing his interactions with other children, worried about saying or doing the wrong thing. William stood up abruptly, his tall frame unfolding from the tiny chair as he began to pace the small confines of the classroom. The protective father in him was warring with his understanding of the complexities their family faced. They couldn't shield their children completely from public attention, but seeing how it was affecting Lewis's sense of self was almost unbearable. Have there been any other incidents? Catherine asked, though part of her dreaded hearing more examples of how her son's childhood innocence was being eroded. A few smaller ones, the teacher confirmed. Children asking if they can come to his birthday party at the palace, assumptions about expensive gifts, questions about meeting famous people. Each incident on its own might not seem significant, but together they're creating an environment where Lewis feels different and isolated from his peers. The teacher reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small piece of paper covered in Lewis's careful handwriting. He wrote this during free writing time yesterday. I thought you should see it. Catherine took the paper with trembling hands, William moving to read over her shoulder. In Lewis's unmistakable 7-year-old script, they read, I wish I was just normal Lewis. I want to play football without everyone watching. I want friends who like me, not my house. I don't want to be special anymore. The words hit both parents like physical blows. Their bright, joyful little boy was wishing away the very thing that made him unique, not because he didn't understand his heritage, but because he was beginning to understand all too well how it separated him from others. William sat back down heavily, his head in his hands for a moment as he processed his son's written plea for normalcy. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. He's 7 years old. He should be worried about losing teeth and learning to ride a bike, not about whether his friends like him for who he is. Mrs. Henderson nodded with deep understanding. That's exactly what I was thinking. Louis is such a genuine, sweet child. He deserves to experience the joy and simplicity of childhood without these adult pressures and expectations. Catherine folded the piece of paper carefully, as if it were something precious and fragile. In many ways, it was exactly that, a window into her child's heart, a cry for help that he had been too young to voice directly to his parents. "What do you think we should do?" she asked the teacher, recognizing that Mrs. Henderson had far more experience with childhood development than either she or William did. "How do we help him navigate this without making him feel even more different or isolated?" The teacher leaned forward, her expression thoughtful and caring. "I think the first step is having an honest conversation with Louis about what he's been experiencing. He needs to know that his feelings are valid and that you understand how difficult this has been for him. Children often suffer in silence when they think their problems are too big or too complicated for adults to understand." William nodded slowly. "We've been trying to protect him from these kinds of situations, but maybe in doing so, we haven't prepared him with the tools he needs to handle them when they inevitably arise." "Exactly," Mrs. Henderson agreed. "Louis is incredibly bright and emotionally intelligent. If you approach this conversation with honesty appropriate for his age, I think you'll find that he's more capable of understanding and coping than you might expect." Catherine looked around the classroom, taking in the cheerful displays of children's work, the reading corner with its comfortable cushions, the science table with its collection of interesting rocks and shells. This should be a safe space for Louis, a place where he could learn and grow and make mistakes without the weight of public expectation on his shoulders. "What about the other children?" she asked. "How do we address their behavior without making Louis feel even more singled out?" Mrs. Henderson had clearly given this considerable thought. "I'd like to do a series of lessons on friendship, respect, and treating everyone equally. Not specifically about Louis, but about how we interact with all our classmates. Children this age are very receptive to lessons about kindness and fairness when they're presented in the right way." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, covering practical strategies for helping Louis rebuild his confidence and reconnect with his classmates. They discussed ways to encourage normal childhood friendships, how to address inappropriate questions or requests, and how to maintain Louis's sense of self-worth in the face of external pressures. As they prepared to leave the school, both William and Catherine felt a mixture of emotions. They were grateful to have a clearer understanding of what Louis had been experiencing, but they also felt a deep sadness that their little boy had been struggling with such complex feelings without their knowledge. Walking to their car, Catherine turned to William with a determined expression. "We need to talk to him tonight. Really talk to him, not just ask how his day was, but create space for him to share everything he's been feeling." William nodded, his own resolve strengthening. "And we need to talk to George and Charlotte too. This affects the whole family, and they might have insights or experiences that could help us understand how to support Louis better." As they drove home through the familiar countryside, both parents were lost in thought about the conversation ahead. They knew it would be difficult, potentially emotional for everyone involved, but they also knew it was necessary. Their son needed to understand that he wasn't alone in his struggles and that his family would always be his strongest source of support and understanding. The setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape as they approached Adelaide Cottage, where Louis would soon be returning from his after-school activities. Both William and Catherine felt a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead in helping their youngest child navigate the complexities of his unique position while preserving the joy and innocence that made him so special. The evening air carried the scent of autumn as the Wales family gathered around the kitchen table at Adelaide Cottage. Catherine had prepared Louis's favorite meal, shepherd's pie with extra vegetables hidden throughout, hoping the familiar comfort might help ease what she knew would be a difficult conversation. The warm lighting cast a gentle glow over the scene, making the kitchen feel like the safe haven she desperately wanted it to be for her children. George and Charlotte sensed the unusual atmosphere immediately. At 10 and 8 respectively, they were old enough to recognize when their parents needed to discuss something important. Louis sat between his siblings, still quieter than usual, occasionally glancing up at his mother and father with those perceptive eyes that seemed to hold too much understanding for his 7 years. William cleared his throat gently as Catherine finished serving dessert, Louis's beloved sticky toffee pudding, another small gesture meant to provide comfort for whatever lay ahead. The prince looked at his wife, and she nodded slightly, a silent communication that spoke of years of partnership and shared parenting decisions. "Children," William began, his voice warm but serious, "Mummy and I had a conversation with Mrs. Henderson today about some things that have been happening at school. Louis, sweetheart, we know that some situations have been difficult for you lately, and we want to talk about them as a family." Louis's spoon paused halfway to his mouth, and Catherine watched as her youngest son's shoulders seemed to tense slightly. George and Charlotte immediately focused their attention on their little brother, their protective instincts kicking in as they realized he had been dealing with something challenging. "It's not your fault," Catherine added quickly, seeing the worried expression that flashed across Louis's face. "Nothing that's been happening is your fault, and you're not in trouble. We just want to understand how you've been feeling so we can help make things better." Charlotte, with the emotional intelligence that often surprised adults, reached over and gently touched Louis's hand. "You can tell us anything, Lou," she said softly, using the family nickname that always made him smile. "We're your family, and families help each other." George nodded earnestly in agreement. "Yeah, and if someone's being mean to you at school, we want to know about it. Charlotte and I have had to deal with some weird stuff too because of who our family is." The acknowledgement from his older siblings seemed to give Louis the permission he needed to finally voice what he had been carrying alone. His eyes filled with tears as he looked around the table at the faces of the people who loved him most in the world. "The other kids keep asking me things I can't do," Louis said, his voice small but gaining strength as he continued. "They want me to invite them to live in palaces and make their dad's nights and get them famous people's phone numbers. When I say I can't do those things, they think I'm being mean or lying." William felt his heart clench at his son's words, but he maintained a calm expression, not wanting to add his own emotions to Louis's already heavy burden. "That must feel very confusing and frustrating, son. You're absolutely right that you can't do those things, and you shouldn't feel bad about that. But the worst part," Louis continued, his voice beginning to crack with emotion, "is that Tommy Fletcher said I'm selfish because I won't help his family. He said if I really cared about my friends, I would ask Daddy to fix their problems. I do care about my friends, but I don't know how to fix anything." Catherine moved her chair closer to Louis, wrapping her arm around his small shoulders as tears began to flow down his cheeks. "Oh, my darling boy," she whispered, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You are not responsible for fixing other people's problems. That's not your job, and it never will be." Charlotte looked confused and slightly angry on her brother's behalf. "That's not fair, Louis. Tommy Fletcher is being really mean if he's saying things like that to you. You're not selfish at all, you share everything with us and you're always kind to everyone." George, despite being only 10, seemed to understand the broader implications of what his brother was experiencing. "Louis, some people don't understand what our family really does. They think we have magical powers or something, but we're just people. Dad works really hard to help the country, but he can't just give people whatever they want." William nodded appreciatively at his eldest son's mature understanding. "George is exactly right, Louis. Our family does have certain responsibilities and opportunities to help people, but not in the way your classmates might think. We can't grant wishes like genies in bottles, and that's not what being royal actually means." "Then, what does it mean?" Louis asked, looking up at his father with genuine curiosity mixed with his distress. "I don't understand why people think we're so different. I just want to play football and have friends who like playing with me." Catherine exchanged a meaningful look with William. This was the conversation they had always known they would need to have with their children, but Louis's situation had forced it to come earlier than they had anticipated. "Being part of our family means we have a chance to serve other people," William explained carefully, choosing words that would make sense to a 7-year-old. Daddy's job is to support Granny and help make life better for everyone in our country. Sometimes that means visiting hospitals to cheer up sick people, or supporting charities that help families who don't have enough food or safe places to live. But, Catherine continued, it doesn't mean we can solve every problem or give everyone everything they want. We're people who happen to have a special job, but we're still just people. We get tired, we make mistakes, we have feelings that can be hurt, just like everyone else. Louis considered this for a moment, wiping his nose with the tissue Charlotte had thoughtfully handed him. So when Tommy Fletcher's dad lost his job, I can't actually make Dad give him a new one? That's right, William confirmed gently. I can support programs that help people find work, and our family can highlight how important it is for everyone to have good jobs, but I can't personally hire Tommy's dad or create a job just for him. George leaned forward, his young face serious with understanding. It's like how you can care about someone being sad, but you can't make them not sad anymore just because you want to help them feel better. Exactly, Catherine said, impressed once again by her children's ability to grasp complex concepts when they were explained with love and patience. Caring about people and wanting to help them is wonderful, Louis. But you're not responsible for solving their problems, especially not when you're 7 years old. Charlotte had been listening thoughtfully to the entire conversation, and now she spoke up with her characteristic directness. Louis, did you tell Mrs. Henderson about Tommy Fletcher being mean to you? Because that's not okay, even if he's upset about his dad. Louis shook his head. I didn't want to get him in trouble. His family is really worried about money, and I felt bad that I couldn't help them. William reached across the table to take his youngest son's hand. Louis, your kindness and empathy are beautiful qualities, and Mummy and I are very proud of how much you care about other people. But you have to understand that other people's problems are not your responsibility to fix, and it's never okay for someone to be unkind to you because they're frustrated about their own situation. What Tommy did was bullying, Catherine added firmly but gently. It doesn't matter if he's worried about his family, he had no right to make you feel guilty about things that are completely out of your control. We need to make sure Mrs. Henderson knows about this so she can help Tommy understand better ways to handle his feelings. The conversation continued for another hour as the family worked through Louis's experiences, his feelings, and practical strategies for handling similar situations in the future. They talked about how to respond to inappropriate requests, how to recognize the difference between genuine friendship and people who might want to use him for perceived benefits, and, most importantly, how to maintain his own sense of self-worth in the face of external pressures. George and Charlotte shared their own experiences with similar challenges, helping Louis understand that he wasn't alone in navigating the complexities of their family's public profile. Charlotte told him about a girl in her class who had tried to become her friend only because she wanted to be invited to Charlotte's birthday party at a fancy venue. George shared how some boys at school sometimes treated him differently during sports, either being too careful around him or expecting him to be better at everything because of who his father was. The important thing, William told all three of his children, is to remember who you are beyond our family's position. Louis, you are a kind, funny, intelligent little boy who loves football and makes the best Lego castles I've ever seen. That's who you are. The fact that you're also a prince is just one part of you, not the most important part. Catherine nodded in agreement. And real friends will like you for who you are as a person. They'll want to play with you because you're fun to be around, not because they think they can get something from knowing you. As the evening wound down and it came time for the children's bedtime routines, Louis seemed noticeably lighter, as if the weight he had been carrying had been shared and, therefore, lessened. He hugged both his parents extra tightly, and Catherine could feel some of the tension leaving his small body. Mummy, Daddy, Louis said as Catherine tucked him into bed, I'm glad we talked about everything. I feel less confused now. I'm glad too, sweetheart, Catherine replied, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. And, remember, you can always talk to us about anything that's worrying you. We're a team, our whole family, and teams support each other. William appeared in the doorway, having finished saying goodnight to George and Charlotte. Tomorrow, Mummy and I are going to talk to Mrs. Henderson about some changes that might help make school better for you and for other children who might be feeling confused about these things. And, Louis, Catherine added, if anyone asks you to do something you can't do or makes you feel guilty about not being able to help them in ways that aren't realistic, what are you going to say? Louis thought for a moment, then replied with growing confidence, I'm going to say that I care about them, but I'm just a kid and some things aren't my job to fix. And then, I'm going to tell you and Daddy about it. Perfect, William said with a proud smile. That's exactly right. As his parents left his room, Louis felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks, a sense of peace about who he was and where he belonged. The conversation hadn't solved all his problems, but it had given him the tools and support he needed to face tomorrow with renewed confidence. 3 weeks had passed since that pivotal evening conversation at Adelaide Cottage, and the changes in Louis were remarkable. Catherine watched from the kitchen window as her youngest son kicked a football around the garden with George and Charlotte, his laughter echoing across the grounds in a way that filled her heart with relief and joy. The weight that had seemed to press down on his small shoulders had lifted, replaced by the natural exuberance that had always been so much a part of his personality. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but rather through a series of small victories and carefully orchestrated changes that had gradually restored Louis's confidence and sense of belonging. William had taken an active role in working with the school to implement new approaches to helping all the children understand respect, friendship, and appropriate boundaries. Mrs. Henderson had been instrumental in facilitating these changes. She had conducted a series of thoughtful classroom discussions about treating everyone equally, regardless of their family background or circumstances. The lessons were clever in their simplicity, focusing on universal values of kindness and respect without singling out any particular child or situation. The teacher had also addressed the incident with Tommy Fletcher directly, having a gentle but firm conversation with both Tommy and his parents about appropriate behavior and realistic expectations. It turned out that Tommy's family had been struggling with more than just financial difficulties. They had been dealing with stress and uncertainty that had affected how they talked about solutions and help at home. With proper support and counseling resources connected to the family, Tommy had been able to apologize to Louis and begin rebuilding their friendship on healthier foundations. Catherine remembered the afternoon when Louis had come home from school with a bright smile, eager to tell his parents about his day. Tommy asked me if I wanted to play football at lunch, he had announced proudly. Not because he wanted anything special, just because he thought I was good at passing the ball. And, when I scored a goal, he cheered for me just like he would for anyone else. The simplicity of that interaction, the normalcy of it, had brought tears to Catherine's eyes. It represented everything she and William wanted for their children, the ability to form genuine connections based on who they were as individuals rather than their family's position. William had also made some significant changes to his own schedule and approach to public engagements. Recognizing that his children's well-being needed to take precedence over certain royal duties, he had restructured some commitments to allow for more family time and more opportunities to be present for the everyday moments that meant so much to his children's sense of security and normalcy. One evening, about 2 weeks after their family conversation, Louis had approached his father with a question that showed how much his understanding had grown. "Daddy," he had said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about what you do for work. Is it like being a teacher, but for the whole country?" William had been impressed by his son's analogy. "That's actually quite a good way to think about it, Louis. Teachers help children learn and grow and feel supported. In some ways, that's what our family tries to do for the country, help people feel supported and cared for, and sometimes help them learn about things that are important. And teachers can't give every student everything they want," Louis had continued, working through his understanding. "They can't make everyone get perfect grades or fix every problem at home. But they can care about their students and try to help in ways that are fair and realistic." The maturity of his son's thinking had amazed William, but it had also reassured him that Louis was developing the kind of nuanced understanding that would serve him well throughout his life. The little boy was learning to see his family's role not as a magical solution to everyone's problems, but as a form of service that had both possibilities and limitations. Catherine had been particularly moved by the changes she had observed in Louis's relationships with his siblings. The shared family conversation had brought all three children closer together, creating a stronger sense of solidarity and mutual support. George had taken on an even more protective role, while Charlotte had become Louis's fierce advocate, ready to speak up if she witnessed any unfair treatment. The three siblings had developed their own strategies for handling curious or inappropriate questions from other children. They had practiced responses together, turning what could have been stressful situations into opportunities for education and connection. When someone asked Louis if he lived in a palace, he would explain that his family lived in a regular house, but that sometimes they visited special buildings for work, just like some other people went to offices or shops for their jobs. Mrs. Henderson had reported back to William and Catherine regularly about Louis's progress. The little boy had regained his enthusiasm for classroom activities and had begun participating more actively in group projects and discussions. His natural leadership abilities were emerging in positive ways, as he helped other children work through conflicts or included classmates who seemed left out. The teacher had been particularly impressed with an incident that occurred during a classroom discussion about community helpers. When one child expressed frustration that police officers couldn't prevent all crimes or that doctors couldn't cure every illness, Louis had spoken up with remarkable wisdom for his age. "My dad says that people who help others do the best they can, but they can't fix everything," Louis had explained to his classmates. "That doesn't mean they're not doing a good job. It just means that some problems are really big and complicated, and it takes lots of different people working together to help, and sometimes things still can't be perfect." The observation had led to a rich discussion about realistic expectations, the value of effort versus outcomes, and the importance of appreciating people's contributions even when they couldn't solve every problem. Mrs. Henderson had noted that Louis's contribution had helped several other children in the class work through their own frustrations about limitations and imperfections in the adult world. At home, the family had established new traditions that reinforced their values and their connection to each other. They had started having regular family meetings where all three children could share their experiences, concerns, or ideas about how to handle various situations. These meetings had become opportunities for learning and problem-solving together, with each family member's perspective valued and heard. William had also begun including the children more directly in understanding his work, taking them on occasional visits to charities or community organizations where they could see firsthand how their family's support made a practical difference in people's lives. These experiences had helped all three children develop a more realistic and grounded understanding of public service. During one such visit to a local food bank, Louis had been particularly engaged in helping to sort donations and talking with volunteers about their work. On the drive home, he had reflected thoughtfully on the experience. "I liked helping there," he had told his parents. "It felt good to do something that actually helped people, not just pretend I could fix everything for them. And the volunteers were really nice to me, but they didn't ask me for anything special. They just wanted help carrying boxes and organizing things." Catherine had recognized in that moment that Louis was beginning to understand the satisfaction that could come from genuine service and contribution, separate from the pressures and unrealistic expectations that had been troubling him at school. The changes extended beyond Louis himself to affect the entire family's approach to their public and private lives. William and Catherine had become more intentional about creating boundaries that protected their children's normal development while still honoring their family's responsibilities and commitments. They had also worked with the school to develop better protocols for handling situations where children might be receiving inappropriate pressure from family members to seek special treatment or favors through their royal classmates. The school had implemented gentle but clear guidelines about parent behavior and communication that helped create a more balanced environment for all the children. As autumn deepened and the leaves around Adelaide Cottage turned brilliant shades of gold and red, the Wales family found themselves in a much stronger place than they had been just a few weeks earlier. Louis's struggle had forced them all to grow and adapt, but it had ultimately strengthened their bonds and clarified their values. One evening, as Catherine was helping Louis with his homework, she was struck by how naturally he was navigating a math problem that required breaking down a large, complex challenge into smaller, manageable steps. The approach seemed to mirror how he had learned to handle the social and emotional challenges in his life. "Look, Mummy," Louis said proudly, showing her his completed worksheet. "I figured out that if something seems too big to solve all at once, I can work on one part at a time until I understand the whole thing." Catherine smiled at her son's insight, recognizing the broader wisdom in his words. "That's a very smart approach, Louis. That strategy works for lots of different kinds of problems, not just math ones." "I know," Louis replied with confidence. It's like how I can't fix all my friends' problems, but I can be kind to them and listen when they're sad and share my toys when we're playing together. That's the part one can do. As Catherine tucked her youngest son into bed that night, she reflected on the journey their family had traveled over the past several weeks. The challenges that had seemed so overwhelming at first had become opportunities for growth, understanding, and deeper connection. Louis had not only overcome his difficulties but had emerged stronger and more resilient, with a clearer sense of himself and his place in the world. William joined her in the hallway outside Louis's room, and they stood together in comfortable silence, listening to the peaceful sounds of their children settling down for the night. George was reading quietly in his room, Charlotte was organizing her school supplies for the next day, and Louis was drifting off to sleep with a contentment that had been missing for too long. "He's going to be just fine," William said quietly, echoing the confidence they both felt about their youngest son's future. Catherine nodded, taking her husband's hand as they walked toward their own room. "More than fine," she replied. "All this has taught him things about himself and about life that will serve him well no matter what challenges come next." The Wales family had navigated their crisis with love, honesty, and commitment to each other's well-being. In addressing Louis's difficulties publicly within their family circle, they had strengthened not only his resilience but their entire family's ability to face whatever complexities their unique life might bring. Most importantly, they had preserved the joy and authenticity that made each of their children special, ensuring that Louis could grow up knowing exactly who he was beyond any title or public expectation.